I will condemn absolutely anybody, including my campaign or any other campaign, that makes vicious personal attacks against people.
The Culinary Union, Nevada's largest labor union, said some of its members faced online harassment after they announced concerns about Medicare.
Well, you know, as I said, I am two things. Number one, I'm totally against online bullying and harassment. But also, let me just say this, and I don't want to be overly paranoid here, is that, we live in a crazy time. And there are a lot of folks out there who do bots and all this other thing. I saw some of those things. And there are people out there who want to divide the progressive movement.
All right. Taking on the Bernie bros. Is he doing enough there, Joe?
He should have just condemned them and stopped there. But, Willie, it sounds like he's bringing in bots, trying to blame some of that behavior on bots when he knows, reporters know, and certainly women, journalists especially, and minority journalists especially, who have complained about being the target of these Bernie bros for years, know that it's not bots that are responsible for most of these vicious attacks. And all Bernie can do is condemn it and distance himself from it, which he did before he started blaming bots.
Yeah, the bot point sort of got him off track there. But, yeah, obviously there has been harassment, not just this year, but in 2016 from people online who support Bernie Sanders. Specifically what we're talking about now with Nevada and the debate tonight and the caucuses coming up on Saturday is the members of the Culinary Union who came out against Bernie Sanders because of his Medicare for All plan. And they heard from a lot of Sanders supporters with threats and the like. I think Bernie Sanders also tonight is going to have to answer some questions about some of the people who support him and some of the views they have, more high-profile people who have anti-Semitic views as well. We'll see if he's asked about that. Joining us now, MSNBC contributor Mike Barnicle, former Treasury official and Morning Joe economic analyst Steve Ratner, and politics and journalism professor at Morgan State University, politics editor at The Root, and an MSNBC political contributor, Jason Johnson. Professor Johnson, let me begin with you. And what you're looking at tonight is Bernie Sanders has opened up a lead for himself in the state of Nevada. Also, we looked at California a minute ago. What are you looking at as Mike Bloomberg makes his debut on the debate stage?
Well, a couple things, Willie. First off, are the rest of the Democrats going to stop treating Bernie Sanders like Donald Trump? And what I mean by that is back in 2016, right, all the other Republicans, they really didn't go at Trump. They didn't dump the apple on him that they could because they were sure that he was eventually going to fade, and they wanted all of his supporters to come to him. What happens? He ends up winning. At some point, the rest of the Democratic Party have to go after Bernie Sanders, not just on policy, but how he operates, how he treats his campaign. So I want to see if they're going to go after him as a real frontrunner. The second thing is, what does Mike Bloomberg want to do? Look, I've been watching his old debates from 2001, his debates from 2009. He's not the most exciting person in the world. He doesn't come off as the most charismatic person in the world. And you've got a stage with Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. There's some real personalities there. So I think that if I were Bloomberg, you want to introduce yourself to the public as much as you want to come out swinging on either Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren.
Well, and Mike Barnicle, Elizabeth Warren's talking about everybody attacking Michael Bloomberg tonight. I don't know if she's looked at any of the polls. Michael Bloomberg ain't in first place. Bernie Sanders is in first place, as we used to say in the South, by a country mile. To follow up on what Jason said, if you're attacking Michael Bloomberg, all you're doing is helping the guy who's 20, 25 points ahead of you, and that's Bernie Sanders.
Well, first of all, on Bernie Sanders, and Jason was right on it in his words that we just heard. And Bernie, in the clip that we showed, said, oh, bots this, bots that. I'll tell you what isn't a bot. I'll tell you what's Bernie Sanders' people. And it was a rally they had on Wall Street last week, a funeral for Joe Biden's candidacy, complete with a casket. Complete with a casket, a Biden funeral. Okay, those weren't bots. On Elizabeth Warren, it is hard to understand the guidance she's getting from her campaign people, why she hasn't gone after Bernie Sanders long ago. They were both competing for the same share of the electorate in November and December, and she really stayed away from him. It appears maybe, in retrospect, a mistake.
I wonder, Steve Ratner, whether you look at these polls and you see that Bernie Sanders is in first place, which is the reason Mike Bloomberg jumped into this race, because he didn't want Sanders or Elizabeth Warren to be the nominee. But you'll look at the polls now, and it's looking like Mike Bloomberg may be assuring a Bernie Sanders nomination. If you look at the California numbers, if you look at some of the other Super Tuesday numbers, if you look at the national polls, because it's Sanders way out in front, and it's Joe Biden who's taken the precipitous drop since Michael Bloomberg's been in the race. So you got the two moderates fighting each other in the teens. Well, Bernie Sanders is cruising to victory.
Well, that's certainly a reasonable way to look at it, Joe. I would, in candor, look at it slightly differently. I think there was that fear about Mike Bloomberg coming in and what it would do to Joe Biden. But what happened to Joe Biden, I would argue, what happened to Joe Biden in New Hampshire and in Iowa, and it looks like perhaps in Nevada, had nothing to do with Mike Bloomberg. That simply had to do with how Joe Biden was perceived as a campaigner. And so, in fact, the theory of Mike Bloomberg's case, to some degree, was the idea that sooner or later Joe Biden was not going to get there, and we Democrats needed a strong, moderate alternative to beat Donald Trump, and that Bernie Sanders was not going to do the job. So I think that's how I see it. Now, Bernie Sanders is an incredibly strong candidate. We always, I think, kind of knew he was. I think the fact that Elizabeth Warren kind of imploded simply moved a whole bunch of voters over in his direction, and he is certainly the guy to beat. And I think you'll see that tonight in the debate in terms of how Mike Bloomberg and others treat him.
And to follow up, Mika, on what Mike Barnacle asked, when is Elizabeth Warren going to start attacking Bernie Sanders? It's Bernie Sanders who is in her lane. It's Bernie Sanders who took her votes. It's Bernie Sanders who poses the threat to her nomination, not Michael Bloomberg. Again, I think Biden and Klobuchar should be attacking Michael Bloomberg. But, you know, if you're going to vote for Mike Bloomberg, you ain't voting for Elizabeth Warren.
Right.
And if you're going to vote for Bernie Sanders, you ain't voting for Michael Bloomberg. She has got to pull supporters from Bernie Sanders to her camp to be competitive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the Biden-Bloomberg dynamic is so interesting because Bloomberg's swooping in because Biden is a poor campaigner. I look forward to seeing Mike Bloomberg compare on the national stage because I don't think we've seen him. I think we've seen his commercials for the most part. Right. So it should be fascinating. Everyone stay with us. There's